I'm delighted to welcome you to this event where we're going to be discussing Anna Dixon's new book, The Age of Aging Better. So, Anna, before we start, how are you, and how's it going with the launch of the book?
I'm really well, thank you. Yes, I'm in a very fortunate position working from home, and we've actually had really great response to the book. I was a little worried launching a book, particularly during lockdown and with bookshops closed, but obviously they're now reopened this week, and actually doing these online events, attracting people, perhaps a wider audience than we might otherwise. So all going well, thank you.
Great, and I should say, of course, a full disclosure that I write the foreword to the book, so I'm not an entirely objective assessor of it, but I really enjoyed reading it and was delighted to write the foreword. Now, I think one of the things, actually, we communicated about this when I was reading the draft and writing the foreword, and I remember saying to you, Anna, do you think you should delay this and rewrite it because of coronavirus? And you didn't, and I can understand why you didn't, but I'm interested in if you had taken my advice, and as I say, I'm sure you did the right thing. The book seems to be going very well, but if you had taken my advice and you had rewritten it in the view of the virus, are there things that you would have said and written differently?
Well, obviously the context is completely different from when I wrote the book, but I think actually what we've seen during the coronavirus pandemic is that many of these issues that I write about in the book have actually come to the fore. I suppose both good and ill. So, obviously with all of us spending a lot more time in our houses, I think it's shone a spotlight on the inadequacy of quite a lot of the homes that we live in. We've seen communities coming together, helping each other out in a way that perhaps we couldn't have imagined, which is obviously really positive. Things that I write about the need for flexible working, at least for those of us who can, have been able to continue to work very flexibly from home. But it's also, I think the most important thing and shocking thing has been how it's really shone a light on health inequalities. The impact of the virus, particularly on poorer and BAME communities is devastating. And I think, if I was writing it again, I think I'd be writing about the same issues. I think if anything, I would be more radical in, the changes that I was calling for, because we've also seen the fact that in a crisis, there's decisions been taken that we, again, couldn't have imagined, and some very rapid political, policy changes. So I think probably a stronger focus on inequalities and probably more radical in the changes that are called for.
Yes, I'm surprised, Anna, in a sense, in the answer that you give, that you're not reflecting on the kind of underlying discourse here, which is about the relative importance of people's lives depending on their age, because it does seem to me that's been something which has been occasionally it's surfaced, but we don't know quite how to talk about it, and so there's a kind of narrative here that says, look, we're overstating how bad this disease is, because in the end, most of the people who die are old people who have morbidities and who therefore, in a sense, shouldn't carry the same weight as other people. For example, children who are having their education so badly disrupted.
I mean, clearly there are terribly difficult trade-offs to make in terms of protecting and saving lives and the public health impact. And, the negative impacts that we know are happening, whether that's, domestic violence, the economic consequences, the impact on education. So these are not easy things to weigh up. And you're right that it's a very difficult conversation to have. And those that have sort of ventured into this have quickly stepped back. I think one of the most sort of, I suppose, ageist comments was, I think it was a Telegraph columnist suggesting that, actually this was a cull of older people. So it's brought out the worst, those sorts of attitudes that somehow lives of a particular age are no longer valuable. For most people, over 70, they're still living a very good quality of life and would not see their lives as ones that they would want to come to a premature end as a result of a virus that was spreading in the community. So I think they've made decisions that are going to have consequences for people of all ages for many years to come, and we do have to recognize that. But I think the consequences, of if we had just let this virus, as it were, do its deadliest, I don't think those would have been acceptable to us as a society either. So
how do we square that circle then? Because it seems to me that it is a very complex issue, because in a sense, a murder is a murder. If I murder somebody who's going to die tomorrow, or if I murder somebody who is young, it's still a murder because it's a life. We're taking a life. But yet, within the health service, we know that in concepts like quality of life years and the whole triaging process, there is an implicit assumption that actually the amount of life somebody has got left and the quality of life they're likely to have is a reasonable criterion for people to consider. And in fact, as I understand it, the BMA is subject to a legal challenge from people in relation to the Equalities Act for giving advice, ethical advice that says it is reasonable to use these kind of triaging criteria. Now, it seems to be the danger we're in is getting into what a kind of political correctness trap, where we kind of know that two arguments are true. On the one hand, that every life is a life, and there is a kind of absolute dimension to that, but also recognizing the reality of the decisions that, for example, doctors have to make. Do you have a way out of that?
Yeah, I mean, the whole sort of the chapter really on healthcare, I'm actually one of those that's stepping into these controversial debates in the book about us facing up to death as a inevitability, and recognizing that at the moment, actually a huge amount of what we spend in the NHS is in that last period of our lives. It's not so much about our chronological age, it's more our proximity to death. And we have a system that is geared towards intervention. And I talk about the sort of rule of rescue, which is the sort of guiding principle for medical decision making, which is about saving lives. But what is that resulting in? Is it resulting in people experiencing a good death? Are we actually supporting people to maximize the quality of their life, or are we extending life at the cost of quality? And so I do think that we need a much more open debate as a society about death, dying, what we want in terms of intervention or not, and to support people to have those discussions much, much earlier. And I think that if we had those as a society, we'd have been much better prepared, and we wouldn't have seen, as we did during the initial stages of the outbreak, things like impositions of do not resuscitate orders because of people's age. So I think the big issue is, yes, there are different risks, and those risks are more likely in terms of death rates the older you are, and some of that is to do with biological aging. But that's no justification, I don't think, ever for using age specifically as a criteria, and indeed that would be against the Equality Act. So I think there are a number of things. We should not equate chronological age with biological age. We shouldn't use age as a crude reason for either giving people care or saving their lives. Frankly, we do need as a society to have a much more honest conversation about death and dying. And, should it be different from what it is now? Yes. Should we be spending money in different ways? Yes. Probably more hospice care, more support for palliative care, and less of the sort of, rescuing and indeed very expensive life extending drugs, which I think is where the other sort of big choice is that we perhaps are not making
Yeah, I mean, the problem there, of course, is that we can all collectively say, well, we shouldn't be spending huge amounts of money on things which might add a few months of life to people who are suffering from, I don't know, kind of, very difficult, painful conditions. But then, of course, we're all likely to change our mind if it was our life and our last few months, which is why these debates are so important. Can we just turn to one other aspect of what we've experienced over the last 3 months, and that's around care homes?
Mm.
I mean, obviously, there are the obvious points to be made about the way we treat social carers, about the quality of a lot of the provision in those homes. But is there a deeper problem with the sheer scale to which we warehouse older people in buildings, generally speaking, on the outskirts of towns and cities, at the end of long drives, so that we don't really have to see them and think about them? Isn't there something fundamentally problematic about us as a society wanting to warehouse so many older people?
Yeah. So again, I think this is where the pandemic has again shown just how broken our care system is. Care homes were an afterthought. It seems. I mean, there'll be inquiries, I'm sure, to look into the detail. But the sort of availability of PPE and the advice that was given and support to care homes. We didn't count the deaths for ages. I mean, just these people were invisible, and I think that it is a reflection on how it is. As you say, these are places that most of us don't go in unless we have a relative in them. The workers who are providing that care are very low paid, low skilled, undervalued, not invested in terms of their training. So we really have, I think we're choosing to look the other way, and I suppose this has we've seen it on the news nightly, the cost of that. So hopefully there will be a greater political impetus to finally, after more than 20 years of discussing the future of social care, that they'll actually do something about it. But I do want to pick you up on the sort of care homes. I mean, there's been a huge increase. I mean, that's the whole premise of my book, The Age Shift, a huge increase in the proportion of the numbers of people over 85. And remember, it is, again, a limited period of dependency that we have towards the end of our life, when we might need the sort of intensity of support 24/7 that is offered in a care home setting. But more and more of us are being cared for at home. So the other bit that's very hidden is the burden on family carers, unpaid carers, and the home care workforce that's going into people's homes to provide that sort of personal care, with bathing and going to the toilet and so on. And we mustn't think that we just need to reinvent care homes, or that care homes are not a good place. For some people, they can be the right setting. We need to think of them more like hospices. So I think the issue is that the people in care homes now, say compared to 20 years ago, have much higher levels of need, and many of them are towards the end of their life, and yet the training, the investment, the philosophy is nothing like that in hospices. So I think we do need to invest in change the support for care homes, but we absolutely have to recognise that more and more of us want to and will be living in our own homes, which is why I also have a whole chapter in the book on housing and how our homes have to radically change to enable us to live out our lives unto death, potentially, in our own homes.
One last question before I move on to another kind of line of inquiry, which is, how hopeful are you, Anna? You've been around this debate for some time, and you know how government works.
Yeah.
The history of care funding policy is utterly shameful. It's a history of politicians ducking difficult issues, Tony Blair, politicians exploiting issues, which is, I'm afraid, what David Cameron did with the kind of notion of a death tax, and also, when politicians are brave, to be fair to them, they get a good kicking. So when Theresa May put forward a pretty reasonable set of proposals in her manifesto, many people saw it as a kind of turning point that led to having a pretty disastrous campaign and only just scraping home against a pretty problematic Labour leader. So do you believe, I'm going to put you on the spot here, Anna, is this finally going to get our politicians to make the decisions they have to make to have a sustainable social care funding model?
I hope so. I think that it's not actually that easy. It's not the technicality, and to be honest, it's not even the money. So, again, there are all these sort of naysayers and doommongers that predict that the aging of the population is going to bankrupt the NHS and we're just not going to have the money. I mean, to be honest, we spend so little on social care that even spending quite a lot more on social care is certainly not going to have a massive impact on, GDP or the public finances. I mean, it's compared to, say, furlough or these other things. So I think the issue is the public, in a way. Do
you think that you don't need a new care model? You just need to spend more on it?
No, we need both. We need funding and a new care model. We definitely need both. And I think, you gave some examples there of where the politics have gone wrong before. And I think the common thing with all of them is that the public don't understand that social care isn't part of the NHS, is not free, that their home is at risk, the value of their home to pay for care fees. And they, think when they understand that it's very unfair that if you happen to be somebody that has dementia and needs a lot of expensive care towards, that latter period of your life for quite a long time, that, you're going to have to, and your family and your home is going to, basically all of that money is going to go on those fees. Whereas if you have, heart disease or a stroke and, or indeed cancer, where the NHS under continuing care will pay for a lot of what we call social care. So the system is incredibly confusing. The public don't understand it. When you do realise it, because you're navigating it yourself for your loved ones, you do not have the energy to start and be politically active about it. So I think that's, to be honest, at the heart of the problem. I think the public do want this to be funded properly. They do want it to be on a more parity with the NHS. So I think that the government has to come forward with a solution, but it needs to not be just putting more money into the current system. It needs to also change the current system.
Just two thoughts on that before we move on. I mean, one is I've been doing a podcast called Bridges to the Future, exploring how the crisis might lead to change. And one of the people I interviewed was Liz Kendall. And she did say at the end, I asked her, would she be willing to work with the government and other parties to try to achieve some kind of consensus? And she gave some riders to her commitment, but she'd ultimately say that she would be willing to try to do that. So given that we need a long-term solution, I think you and I should both join together in encouraging our politicians to come together and try to reach a consensus across the parties. Because whatever we do, it's going to involve trade-offs, involve sacrifices, but it needs to happen. Yeah. The second thing to say is that the select committee, I think 3 select committees last year set up a citizens' assembly to explore social care funding. And that citizens' assembly, learning all the things, as you said, Anna, that people don't know, but then they learnt, and citizens are perfectly capable of reaching very sophisticated judgments when they know the facts. They came up with a model which was pretty sensible, but unfortunately, although the MPs were impressed, the government, surprise, surprise, wasn't listening. Let's move on to a second dimension of this debate, which is, I might crudely caricature, and both organisations will be irritated by me doing this, but the contrast between the kind of Age UK view of our older of intergenerational issues and the Resolution Foundation view of intergenerational issues. So the former view is that old people are put upon, that they are victims, that they suffer from poverty and loneliness, and in a sense, we aren't fulfilling our duty towards them, having spent their lives as citizens and workers. And then there's a Resolution Foundation view. David Willits is a strong articulates this very well, which is that baby boomers, now becoming older people like me, that we've basically eaten all the pies, that we have had all the benefits, that, and we've pulled up the drawbridge behind us because young people now can't afford houses. And that one of the fundamental problems of politics is that old people vote more than young people. And so systematically policy favours older people rather than young people. And given that young people are the future of the country, that's not only unfair, but it's actually disastrous for us. So where do you stand on this? I mean, I'm caricaturing both their positions, but where do you stand on the Age UK Resolution Foundation spectrum?
Well, I suppose, the fact is that we all are guilty, I think, of using ageist stereotypes. And I would say both of those are ageist stereotypes of different sorts. The sort of charity fundraising, pull your heartstrings, lonely old person at Christmas, works quite well if you're trying to get people to put their hand in their pocket. And the sort of the old versus young intergenerational issues, is in a sense an easy shorthand for some of the, but what they both have in common, and actually we've seen this from research looking across the media, advertising, public policy, and the charity sector, is they're all negative. You look across all of these domains, and when older people or aging are talked about, it is overwhelmingly negative. And I think that is I would say part of the problem as to why we haven't faced up to the age shift, and why some of the policy ideas that come forward are misconceived. Everything from triple lock or abolishing stamp duty, they're not actually getting to the heart of the issue. And I think they basically fail to understand the huge diversity of and indeed inequalities that exist in every generation. So I think what we really need is to start and have a much more realistic view of the diversity and reality of later life, and also recognise, sometimes the 50 plus are put together in one category. If we really believe that some of us are going to have a 100-year life, we're talking about half our lives, and we're certainly talking about, several generations. So I think there's a real need to recognise both that there are multiple life stages that we experience, and that there's a great diversity within generations.
So there's two different elements to answer, and I just want to look at the balance of them. So one is that what we need to do is to understand the differences amongst older people, particularly in relation to age, that being a 50-year-old is very different to being an 85-year-old. And although you said earlier we need to make the distinction between health age and chronological age, but then on the other one is a point which is almost, to use a word that only certain people ever use, progressives use, intersectionality. But it's also that your second point is, well, look, age goes with class, or it goes with ethnicity, or and you have to understand gender, and you have to understand the way in which age mixes with other characteristics in order to fully understand the picture. So talking about old people as a lump kind of misses it. So the Resolution Foundation critique may be largely true for middle class older people. It's not nearly so true for working class older people, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a real risk, if we have this wealthy baby boomer stereotype, we're missing out on the 1.8 million people that our joint work at Centre for Ageing Better with the Resolution Foundation identified, who are between 50 and state pension age, who are struggling financially. They're in these low to middle income households. They're still working very hard, but they're on low pay, they're poor living standards, their housing costs are very high. They are not able to save anything really for their own later life. So they're a group that we should be worried about. And I think that, with the stereotypes and also the 2 million pensioners in relative poverty, there's a real risk, I think, that it means that we do overlook some of these other inequalities, and particularly, when it comes the point you were making about, yes, a life stage of 50s is different from a life stage of 80s, but there is also where you say the intersectionality with class. If you look at the sort of life expectancy gap between richest and poorest areas, but if you also look, actually, it's even bigger, the healthy life expectancy gap. So men in the poorest areas of the country can expect to have 18 years less in good health than those in the wealthiest areas. And actually the gap for women is more, it's 20 years. So we're talking about people in the poorest communities experiencing ill health and disability in their early 50s, and are similar to someone in their early 70s in the sort of wealthiest area. So the realities of aging are very, very different.
Yeah, no, I remember being brought up short by that realization when I was working for Tony Blair and the Adair Turner review, the pensions review, which was a brilliant piece of work Adair did there, and has made a real contribution to us having a better pension system. It's still, as your book points out, still far from perfect, but at least more people are now saving, and we have the incentives. And I remember that, it seemed to me completely logical, as Adair argued, that we would have to raise the pension entitlement age over time for the system to be affordable. And that's what most developed world countries are doing. Because what I hadn't thought of, and what did bring me up short, was that if you are working class and your life expectancy is much lower, then, you're talking about getting rid of 20% of your likely period of life after work. Whereas, if you're middle class and you expect to live to your 85, then taking 1 year out of that isn't so great. So we always have to remember these things when we talk about the elderly or old people, don't we?
Yes, and that's the point, I suppose, about sort of misguided policies. I mean, Cridland, who did the latest state pension review, really looked at some of that analysis about average life expectancy, because obviously if you increase state pension age with average life expectancy, as you say, obviously you're effectively taking years of money away from people who are poorer. The other thing you're doing is that people who are potentially in manual work are more likely to have those health conditions. They struggle anyway to keep working until state pension age. They're much more likely to be falling out of work before state pension age. And so one of the consequences of increasing state pension age, and we've seen this with women, yes, some who are able will work for longer, but another group end up on benefits. So previously on ESA, employers support allowance. And so actually what we're just doing is we're shifting people from the pension system over onto the benefit system. But then the experience of the benefit system for those older job seekers is not good. I'm sure, like you, when you're on the radio, you get letters afterwards from members of the general public, and I've been on quite a bit talking about the need to work for longer and so on. And I get some heartbreaking letters, and one of them, it's a story I retell in the book, and I call her Jenny. And she obviously at 60, she'd been caring out of work to care for her father, who then died, and had gone back to looking for work. And basically, was being required to take some very low paid, one of them was seasonal sort of postal work, quite physically demanding. It's very short lived. Unfortunately, during that period, they messed up her housing benefit. And so she got into arrears. That had a detrimental effect on her mental health. And, she then got sanctioned, went into further debt. And, the consequence of that was really, really negative. And so she did end up going on to ESA. But at the end of it, she just said, fundamentally, I'm 60 and nobody wants to hire me. And, she's not going to draw her state pension until what's sort of 66 now. So, that's a long time to be, in that position, and, then entering your later life with no savings and, no property in this case. So then, dependent on housing benefit and state pension for the rest of what could be still quite a long life. So I think there's a real need that this is looked at, much more in the round. So yes, maybe we do need to keep a single state pension age, but then we have to look at blending the availability of benefits and pension credit and stop sanctioning people in those years before state pension.
And do you think ultimately, Anna, that a universal basic income might be part of how we would deal with this? What I mean by that is that when pensions were invented, people left school at 14. The average life expectancy at retirement was 18 months. It's a completely different world. Mm. And if we were to have a form of universal basic income, rather than the very concept of pensions, we simply said, look, everybody is entitled to the minimum that, to a subsistence level. Then on top of that, if you've got health needs, you get more money. If you've got children, you get more money, housing. But everybody is entitled, unless, just by dint of being a citizen, they're entitled to the wherewithal to be able to at least kind of subsist. Do you think in a kind of, in an imaginary perfect world, you wouldn't have the concept of pensions at all?
Yeah, and I sort of float that idea. I mean, particularly the way that the state pension has been changed, it's not earnings related at all. And I think we ought to just say it should just be universal. I mean, to be honest, even the contributory link, there's so much being done to try and make sure that carers and other people who've got interrupted working careers will not get penalised. But actually, women do really badly still in general out of the pension system because of their interrupted working lives. So I think, there would be a simplicity, at least for the pension, of really making it a universal, basic income. But then it does raise the question, well, if effectively we've got a universal basic income for people of a certain age, and we've got all these problems, particularly in the transition, to that point, and quite a lot of people who are actually worse off, at the very bottom end of the income scale, if you're on benefits, you're actually worse off before you get to state pension age. Maybe the answer is, to just have a universal basic income across the whole life course. And, and then, the decision about when is state pension age is no longer an issue. And actually, what we do know at the moment is that some people are stopping work at state pension age. They might actually benefit from working longer, but there is a sort of, although we don't have a default retirement age any longer, so you could work longer, that the age of state pension is still somehow a sort of a moment when people stop. Whereas again, I think if you had a universal basic income, there's decisions about when am I working and trying to save, and then how am I flexing that over my life, I think, could be a good solution. So perhaps, yes, that would be one of the ones that if I were being a bit more radical, I might have pushed a bit harder to say yes to a universal basic income.
Yeah, and it's interesting the point you make about the kind of psychological effect of having a pension entitlement age, which is that it seems to be sending a signal, which is, well, your working life is over, and of course that's entirely arbitrary. And we know that for most people, actually being active, including work or volunteering, is good for you. My favorite recent story about older people is my mother has been thinking about moving into she's middle class and she's got a reasonable amount of money. She's thinking about moving to a place in Eastbourne, which, is a residential provision, but they do all your meals and they do all your cleaning. And she's desperate, like a lot of old people, not to feel dependent. But she chatted to a woman who said, the great thing about here is that because I don't have to cook and I don't have to clean, I'm on the committee for the local theatre. I'm on the committee for the local residents society. I'm massively involved in civic life because I don't have to do all this other stuff, which I thought was a wonderful way, actually, of thinking about getting older and about care. That rather than thinking about care as being one foot in the grave, think about it as something which might enable you to do other things, when society maybe looks after you a bit more.
Yeah, and, I mean, we've really seen with COVID the impact on volunteering. I think there's suddenly been a realisation about how much over 70s are doing to keep our communities going. And the idea that we've all been removed, obviously it's been great. We've seen new volunteers come forward, mutual aid groups springing up, people helping one another. But actually for our communities and for those individuals, that withdrawal is really bad because, one, as you say, doing that stuff is what gives us meaning, enjoyment, is important to our well-being, but it's also hugely important to our communities. So I think there's going to be a real need, as hopefully over 70s and other people perhaps who've been shielding are confident to come back out, are supported to re-engage, because without them, and for them, it's a really critical part of enjoying their sort of later life is, being able to continue to contribute. And I think that's one of the things that was resisted with the lockdown and the sort of labelling of all over 70s as vulnerable, was this idea that they were needy. And, for friends of mine in that age category, one friend, he really felt that removal of autonomy, just to pop down to the shop and buy himself something. I mean, he was lucky; he had family nearby, were able to drop shopping off for him. But he felt that very, very strongly in terms of his identity, that sort of removal of independence, and I think that's been quite damaging, actually.
Yeah, no, I've absolutely noticed that there's an ambivalence amongst older people, which is, on the one hand, they kind of are grateful to the rest of the population for whom COVID is, generally speaking, much less dangerous for kind of putting their interests first. But on the other hand, a kind of sense of, categorizing us all as being at risk denies us our difference and our agency. Anna, we're nearly running out of time. I could talk to you all night, but I want to ask you about something which is in the book, and but in a sense, I guess if I had one criticism of the book, it would be that there's almost a point I wanted you to make more deeply about the kind of deep nature of ageism, and why it is, what it is in our society, which means that unlike many other societies, tribal societies, ancient societies, other parts of the world, actually, we don't revere older people. We don't revere the wisdom of older people. And I think that's partly to do with consumer culture and the messages of consumer culture. So you do talk about this a bit, but I wonder whether we will ever really tackle some of the problems that you describe, as long as we still really deep down think that getting old is basically a tragic process.
Yeah, no, I agree that, while we see aging as some, process of decline, we associate it with dementia, with disease. We're not going to, look forward to something like our future selves. And, I think it's also a problem because it means we don't then plan and prepare. Because we're not actually thinking about it, we're in denial. So I do think that it is deeply problematic that we have such a negative view of that stage of all of our lives. So I see it less about the sort of othering of older people. That is an issue. But this idea that sort of aging is an inevitable process of decline. I mean, on the other hand, in the book, I also don't think the sort of can we extend life forever and the sort of Silicon Valley, can we put off death forever is the way to go either. But there's a lot in between there, which is actually, if we do things now, both individually and as a society, there's no reason why we can't live out most of that extra time, as Andrew Scott and Linda Grattan sort of call it, in good health and active and enjoying a decent quality of life. But as I said, at the moment, that's not the reality for a lot of people because of inequalities. And, unless we do something now as a society, there's a risk that sort of, I set out a sort of dystopian vision of an age of aging badly, but, that's already a bit of a reality for some people and in some places. And I think, there's a risk that is the reality for a lot more people if we don't do something now.
You see, I'm a much nicer person than I was 20 years ago. I mean, that's partly because I was so unbelievably ghastly when I was younger, but that's kind of
20 years ago, Matthew, you weren't that
no, well, you didn't know half of it, but that's part of it for me, is that I'm acutely aware of the fact that I do, I apologize. I'm 59 and I apologize a lot for being 59. I just do, and I kind of do it in a way to try to stop other people doing it, and I kind of realize it's pathetic and I shouldn't do it and it's self-serving. But, I think probably at least once a day I say something like, oh, well, I'm so old, or, you won't remember this, or, I know it's just and I do all of that.
Internalize it. I mean, that's the reality. If you're bombarded with these negative things, product marketing saying anti-aging products, that somehow, if you lose your beauty, I don't know, if you had a birthday, or it sounds like you've got a big one coming up, but I mean, I bet there'll be quite a lot of jokes about, your age. Of
course there will. No, of course there will. And it, we wouldn't allow it about race or about gender. And I don't want, I think arguably there's, I think racism and sexism are huge issues, but I worry rather that we are living in a world where it feels like you've got to tread on eggshells all the time. And I don't want to have that about age. I don't mind people teasing me about the fact that I've got a bit older and that and that, you know, how delighted I am when I move into a different category in parkrun because I'm more likely to win it. You know, that's all fine. It's all absolutely fine. But I do want to sometimes say, when I'm once again apologizing for my age and being out of touch, I want to say, actually, you know, I know so much more than I used to. I'm so much wiser than I was before. My ego, you know, which is, as you know, Anna, an enormous problem. But I finally got my ego under control. It's taken me 59 years, but my ego is now manageable. You know, I have to do a lot of work, but it's manageable. But we don't really talk about that side of getting older, do we? And actually, when you think of something like climate change, for example, it seems to me that the wisdom of older people, the concern that older people have for their grandchildren, the sense that older people often have towards, you know, later in their life, that they do care a lot about the world they're leaving behind. That we're losing that because we have such a negative view.
Well, and I think that's where the divisive of young versus old and intergenerational is really unhelpful, because actually, you know, when the climate emergency activists were occupying in central London, there was a huge age range of people who were, you know, passionate about that issue, and actually quite a lot of retired people, you know, were down there alongside students, you know, protesting, and were very experienced protesters, many of them, because they'd done it all before in the 60s. So, you know, I do think it's around coming together. This, you know, it's a shared humanity. We are, you know, all living on this planet, and I do, you know, you see it coming together around climate change. You know, the whole sort of really, I think, very, you know, divisive thing around the Brexit vote, that somehow it was older people who, you know, didn't really care about the future of young people and voted for Brexit. You know, I mean, I think our society is quite age segregated, and I do think there is a real risk that actually some of these are fueling, you know, this idea of young versus old, when actually we're all part of age diverse families, age diverse communities. You know, given the number of people now working into later life, we're all mostly part of age diverse workforces. You know, we do need to make more of our sort of policy approach about what's going to work for all of us, and actually much more of coming together around issues that we care about or interests that we have. You know, I think there is a lot of the sort of clubs for older people, activities for older people, this idea that there is, you know, a youth centre, an older people's day centre. Why do we not just have a sort of community hub where we all, you know, go and hang out? So I do think we need to rethink, you know, that sort of age segregation of both activities, places and spaces. And the more time we spend with people, the more understanding builds. We know that about, you know, all sorts of, you know, stereotypes, whether that be race or sexuality, that, you know, actually it's the knowing. So we do need to create communities both of interest and communities of place that are inclusive of people of all ages. And I think that's got to be the way forward.
Well, Anna, it's been fantastic. We've established that I'm in the prime of my life, and we've established that you're a brilliant thinker, and we've established that your book is a wonderful book that everybody ought to buy. It's been fantastic talking to you. I know you're going to stay online and answer some questions, so thank you for spending so much time with me. Well, thank you, Matthew. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and you've given me a good grilling. I felt at moments we were on the moral maze, but maybe we could do that at a future date. Thanks, Anna. Bye. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.